Yeah, thank you. In my talk, I'm going to cover two topics: synergy and importance of group size. That has been given with only limited coverage in the conference thus far, which I feel deserves to be highlighted. And this is work done together with co-authors, who you see down here on the bottom half of the slide. My talk is roughly structured into three parts. The first part, I will introduce the concept of synergy, and I will also mention how this can be modeled mathematically in a simple framework. Then in the second part, we will discuss the importance of group size and the effects of different group size on the evolution of cooperation. And finally, in the third part, I will try to wrap this together in an example that combines both effects, synergy and the formation of groups with different group sizes. So, let's start off with synergy. So in the traditional public goods game, which many of you know, you invest a certain amount. This amount gets multiplied with a constant factor. This becomes the public good, which is then distributed among the participants. And this means that the benefits are proportional to the total corporate investments of the group. But in many situations, I think it's more realistic to assume that the benefits somehow depend in a non-linear way on the total investment. And a particularly important example, in my opinion, is synergy. And this occurs when each additional increase in contributions has a higher contribution to the benefit than the last one. So essentially you get more than the sum of the parts. So let me give some examples. The first one is ants using pheromone trails. So ants walking around deposit smelling chemical, pheromone, and this helps other ants with navigation, and eventually they can build up trails that can lead them to food sources. So they build up an efficient transportation network. And for this to work, many ants need to be involved in depositing these pheromones. If only a few ants do it, then it's practically useless. They will walk randomly, and it's just a wasted effort. But as soon as you start to approach a certain threshold of ants, then it makes sense to deposit this pheromone. You get a very big benefit from doing it, and the trails can form, and eventually ants can reliably reach the food sources. Another example can be microbes which overcome host defenses. So you can think of a single microbe easily being taken out by the immune system, but if a large number of microbes arrive, then they might overwhelm the local immune defenses and take over the host. So this means that a single microbe, in this case, attacking a host, will not be very successful, but once you have a sufficient critical mass, it certainly pays off to join the effort and you get more benefits from it. Third example, if you go to human societies, could be building a bridge. And here you can see a picture of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. A beautiful one. Of course, if you want to build a bridge of this size, you need a certain amount of people, right? It's not going to work if I try to do it alone, or if just a few of us go and try to build this bridge. It's a useless effort, essentially. But once we reach a critical mass, there's sufficient numbers, then it makes sense. Then we can try this effort and we get the benefit. And at that point, there's a steep increase. Adding on more and more people will actually do a lot for the success of the project. Another example could be scientists writing a joint grant application. I did this last night actually, so it feels very relevant. In this case, if you invest too little, it's essentially useless. Right? There's no point in submitting the proposal if it's not going to be funded. You must have some chance of being funded actually. So there is a minimum investment that you actually need before you see any increase in the possible benefits coming from this. But once you reach this threshold, you can see a quite steep increase. Putting in a few extra hours of work can make all the difference whether the proposal is funded or not. This is also an example of synergy. And finally, we can take collective hunting and collective defense. If I just stick with the latter, because they're very similar, if you want to defend against an invading force, of course, if overwhelmed by this invading force, it's essentially useless, it's suicidal essentially. But once you have sufficient number of defenders, it really helps, it makes a difference. And if you can add on a few more, it could make all the difference in turning this defense from a failure to a successful effort. So also here you will see synergy at some point. And these are just a few examples. So how can we then model this if we want to do it mathematically? Well, we can start by drawing a figure where on the horizontal axis we put the total cooperative investments of the group. And on the vertical axis we have the benefit or the public goods which is produced. And the traditional public goods gain would simply be a straight line where the slope of the line equals this multiplication factor. But if you now change this from a line, you might consider something like this, accelerating benefit function. When might this occur? For me, it's not so easy to think of examples, but one could be maybe donating to a charity. If you do it, it feels very good for you, and that's most of the benefits, so you get it immediately. And then when you increase your contribution, maybe it has diminishing return. But I'm sure we can also find other examples. Synergy then, on the other hand, would give an accelerating curve, like this. So initially you get very little from the cooperative investment, but after a while, the effects start to kick in, and you really see an increase in the benefit for the group. So the sum is somehow more, or the benefit is more than the sum of its parts. So this would be a way to model synergetic interactions. But of course, in most of these examples I gave, there is eventually a point where you lose these synergetic interactions, lose the acceleration, and you get diminishing returns. One might consider something like this, a sigmoidal benefit function. And in this case, we initially have a synergetic interaction, but then after a while, you reach diminishing returns and it flattens out. Alright, so to study this now mathematically, you can use a framework that was introduced by Michael Beverly, Christopher Howard, and Timothy Killingback in 2004. And in this simple framework, we assume that each of m players contributes some amount, xi, and then receives a payoff, which is simply the benefit that one gets from the total investment. So the total investment is summing up all the contributions from x1 to xn. And then we apply this benefit function, which could be an accelerating function, or a decelerating function, or a linear function, or whatever you want. And then we subtract the cost of the player's investment. So it's a very simple model. You take m players, put them together, each one invests a certain amount, you sum that amount up, and then you get the benefit through this curve, the benefit function. Yeah? And then you subtract the cost. Yeah. Then these cooperative investments, they can change over time through gradual evolution. So typically one think we're trying out different strategies, changing a bit, see how it goes, and then it could increase or it could decrease. Yeah, I could mention here also that normally you divide here by m. If you distribute the benefit, that's another way of doing it. It doesn't matter if you have a fixed group size, because it just scales the benefit function, but it could matter if you have a variable group size. So that's what it is. Alright, so in doing this, they consider quadratic cost and benefit functions. And with quadratic polynomials, and with this one can get all of these benefit functions except the sigmoidal one. So it's possible to represent a linear benefit, a decelerating benefit, and an accelerating benefit, but then you cannot get the sigmoidal with a quadratic polynomial. But in doing this, they found 5 qualitatively different outcomes. So in this figure, I'm going to show you have the cooperative investment in the population on this yellow axis. On the right, you have maximum cooperative investment. On the left, you have the lowest possible cooperative investment. And the green dot shows the current investment in the population. So in the first case, 3 riders took over the population. Even if you start, as we do here, with cooperative individuals, with gradual evolution, they reduce their investments, and eventually one ends up with a population of defectives. So that was the first case. The second case is the exact opposite. Individuals increase the cooperative investments, and eventually they invested maximally. Looks like that. Then there's a third case where the outcome actually depends on where one starts. It's bistable. If the initial cooperative investment of the individuals are too low, then cooperation disappears and the population ends up in a state of full defection. But if one starts with sufficiently cooperative individuals, the opposite occurs. They increase their investment and end up full investments in the end, so fully cooperative population. Then there's a fourth case where the individuals initially increase their contributions, but then it stops and cooperations end up in an intermediate level. And finally, there's a fifth and rather interesting case, which is sort of the subject of this paper. In this case, you end up again at an intermediate level, but then something happens. The population actually diversifies into 2 strategies, one defective strategy and one cooperating strategy, and they can coexist. Yeah, so that's very interesting. But what then about simile? Well, if you have this synergetic benefit function, then essentially we end up in the bistable case. If the investment is too small, it doesn't pay off to join the joint area. So one goes to a full state of full defection. But if the individuals are sufficiently cooperative from the beginning, yes, then it pays off to invest, and the population ends up in a fully cooperative state. So this, of course, poses a dilemma. What do we do if the individuals are not cooperative from the beginning, or how does cooperation get started? Well, I don't have the full answer to it, but one thing I want to note at this point is that increasing the contribution of each individual is just one way of increasing the total contributions. Another way of doing it would be if we simply increase the group size, so we bring in more of these individuals. And together, even if they invest little on their own, together the joint contributions become rather high. Right, so that brings us to the second part, the role of group size. So in 2010, Ulf Diekman, and Clauses and I looked at what would happen if we had fluctuations in group size. And we found in particular that this could either make it more likely that the population diversifies its strategy, or make it less likely. We also find conditions under which a total contribution increase or decrease. So one can wonder, so this clearly shows that group size is important, and one can wonder what is then the effect. And in 2012, worked with Daniel Cornforth, Sam Brown, and David Stumper to look at this question. We studied how the evolution of cooperation changed for different group sizes and different benefit functions. So on this figure, you have group size on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you have the average investment of individuals. And with the decelerating benefit functions, it's exactly as you would expect. Yeah? If you have a small group, it's more likely to see cooperation. Cooperation increases, and if the group is very small, it's essentially fixated to fully cooperating population. If the group is intermediate, say 10 individuals in this case, you end up at an intermediate level of cooperation. And if the group is very large, it's hard to get cooperation going, and essentially it's a state of full defection. So this aligns very well with what one would think, that it's more difficult to have cooperation if you have a large group, and easier if you have a small group. So what then about synergetic benefits? Well, if you have these accelerating benefits, the synergetic one, then the opposite applies. If the group is small, there is no point in joining. You can never gather enough contributions. So then you end up in a state of full defection. But if you have large group sizes, the opposite applies. Now it suddenly can make sense to join the effort. You just need to reach this initial threshold of investment, and then eventually the population ends up in a state of full cooperation. So you can think again of building the harbor bridge. Of course, this is a useless effort if the number of individuals is too small, so you would never see any cooperation. But if you have a large number of people coming together to try to achieve this task, then it makes sense, even if each one does not invest so much. Yeah? The more people you can gather, the easier it is to get cooperation going if you have this interaction. We then looked at this sigmoidal benefit, and as one can guess, they combine aspects of both the decelerating and the accelerating. You see for smaller group size, it's the same as you see for the accelerating ones, the synergetic. For the larger, you see this other curve coming in, and it starts to look a bit more similar to decelerating benefits. And eventually, there is a bifurcation, and the population ends up in full defection. Right, we also looked at other mechanisms that could promote cooperation. So one is assortment, and then we used essentially a pedestrian version of Isashi's work. So we assumed that with some probability pk, an invading mutant was identified by descent k individuals in the group. And by specifying such probability distributions, we could calculate the effects on the evolutionary dynamics. So it depends on the average relatedness and on the variance. But we found that assortment or relatedness increased cooperation as one would expect. Then we also looked at forum sensing, which could be relevant in microbes. It's possible to sense the cooperative the other individuals in the surrounding are. Then one could contribute when it's meaningful and hold back on investments when it's not meaningful. And that also helped to get cooperation going. Okay, so these results clearly show that group size have an effect, right? But in many of these examples I mentioned, the groups are not specified externally, they're sort of they form intrinsically. One has to ask, how do these groups form and come together? And I wish I could answer that, but I cannot. What I can do at the moment is to give you an example at least of how it works in one specific case. Take a look at. So in this study, we considered bark beetles, or rather it was an abstract study, but it was inspired by the bark beetles. This is a more correct way to say it. And what are bark beetles? Well, they are the sphinx you see on the upper left. They are small beetles, and they drill into pine trees. And they live inside these pine trees, and they produce offspring there and so on. And under normal circumstances, they would stay in maybe sick pine trees or dead pine trees. So it's easy to enter them. But under epidemic conditions, when there are many of these around, they can attack living pine trees. And then they come in large groups, and they drill into these pine trees. And the pine trees normally have defenses, which can take care of them. There are some resins or some fluid in the tree, which can drown them or kill them. There's too many drill into the tree. The defenses are overwhelmed. The resources of resins are depleted, and the bark beetles can win. They can take over the tree and kill it. And then they get even more offspring from the tree. And it spreads off and takes off. And eventually it can kill an entire forest. So on this right there, you can see a large number of dead trees. This is a large problem for the forest industry, these outbreaks of bark beetles. So once they get going, it's very hard to stop them, and it has massive economic consequences. But more interesting to us, this is an example of cooperation. So they need to cooperate to overcome the defenses of these healthy trees. They must come in a large group to kill off the tree, to overwhelm the defenses. Otherwise it doesn't work. A single bark beetle will just be killed. So the way they do this is they have some pheromones that attract other bark beetles. And then when they gather sufficiently many, they attack the tree. Jag skulle kunna kan parallellen med model this in a stylized way with an ecological public goods game terminology effect. So there was a need to have a certain number of individuals before one could really have a reproductive success or high payoff. And in this model, we assume that individuals can aggregate by preferentially attach to sites or trees that already have many individuals. And then we evolve this tendency to aggregate. So it could either increase over time or decrease over time. So to show you then how it works in a very schematic way, we have the bark beetles here on the left for the individuals. We have the trees or the sites here in the middle. And then they went one by one to these sites. The first one I will pick the lower one, which is nice, it's just a random choice. They are all the same. The second one, well, it likes to go where there's already one, so it went to the same place. Yeah. The third one did the same, right? It also went to the same place. They were social animals. This fourth one is a bit of a loner, so it takes up its own sign. And then the fifth one also goes to the one where there's already many lichens between. But the last one is also a bit of a loner. And now the population is distributed. And based on the number now at the sites, we can calculate or determine how many offspring they have. Because of the re-effect, the first group, they don't have any offspring. They are simply killed in this case. They die. But the last group, they can reproduce because you can think of it as overcoming the tree's defenses. So they are successful. So it ends up something like this. The first two die, and the last one, they reproduce, and now we have many. And in the next iteration, they sort of leave again and form a new contingent. And then we repeat the process. So these ones will be distributed again among the sites, and it continues like that over and over and over again. So our expectation when we did this was that we would see an intermediate level of aggregation. Yeah, seems good, right? They have some social tendency that helps them to overcome this Lee effect or helps them to end up in groups with a certain number of individuals. But that's not what we found. Rather, we found the opposite. So either evolution eliminates this preferential attachment altogether, so they don't aggregate whatsoever, they have to make a random choice. That's one possible outcome. But the other possible outcome is that they increase their aggregation tendency. They become more and more social until everyone goes to the same tree, essentially. And then they all die. Yeah. They cannot have an offspring if there are too many. So this is known as evolutionary suicide. At some point, it's so bad to go on your own. You're sure to die because no one else does it. So it's better to join a big group, even if that's also not so good in the end. Right? And continuing this process, you end up with one very large group. And all the individuals of one tree just means that they die, right? There's not enough resources to produce any offspring, essentially. The figure here is known as a pairwise visibility plot. Don't worry if you cannot read them, but it just shows, what I said, there's a threshold. If you start with an aggregation level that's below the threshold, you go to this random site, no preferential attachment. If you start above, they increase the tendency to preferentially attach, aggregate, and eventually the entire population goes. Alright, so to conclude, these synergetic interactions, I think, are very likely to be common, and they can make cooperation easier in larger groups and more difficult in smaller groups, which is contrary to what one would usually think. Non-linear costs are also likely to be important. I haven't mentioned those in this talk, but it's worth to keep in mind that it's not only the benefit, but also the cost. And understanding this interplay between non-linear benefits and costs, these functions are shown usually be accelerating or decelerating, and the process of group formation, in my opinion, is a very important topic for future research, very interesting topic to work on, and quite promising as well. So to wrap this up, and if you're interested, I put up some references that you could look at. First, modeling framework in the strategy diversification. Second paper introduces the concept of synergy and gives a few examples of why, or arguments for why one would expect synergetic interactions. And for the second part, a paper on effects of fluctuating group size, and the second paper is about how the evolutionary dynamics changes for different group sizes and for different benefit functions. And finally, if you are interested in this example, then it's published by JTB in the paper last year. All right, that was all I have to say. So if you have any questions, I would of course be happy to answer them.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you for your nice presentation. First, I am interested in your first part. Oh, yes. And you showed 5 elementary mechanisms depending on non-linearity. And later you gave interesting example using sigmoidal function, right? And in case of sigmoidal function, you showed 2 interior fixed points. One is unstable and the other one is stable. And I thought your fifth case, which can cause evolutionary branching. So evolutionary branching can, if evolutionary branching can cause to overcome barrier of bi-stability associated with the other unstable fixed point. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're absolutely right that evolutionary branching or this strategy diversification can of course occur in the setting with certain other benefits as well. But it requires then a suitable cost function, and I left it out this part for simplicity. It can certainly happen. As for overcoming this problem of instability, I'm not so sure, because you should assume that you start off with a population having only one strategy. And that's the population that needs to overcome the instability. But of course, after the strategy has diversified, yes, then you have a population as an evolutionary tractor consisting of both cooperations and effects.
This is very interesting because the other way, so if you increase group size, dynamics can change and population can unilaterally converge to full cooperation, and then you can relax the group size, reduce in group size, and still you can keep full cooperation. But in the first way, you may obtain even partially full cooperation without controlling group size. It's my point. I got interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and you're right. With the synergetic interaction cycle, first increase the group size, then you can fixate cooperation, and you can again decrease the group size. It's actually sufficient if it happens at some point, and then again the groups can become small and still cooperate. It's quite interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I was intrigued by your conclusion that with synergistic effects you can sustain cooperation in large groups. And I was wondering, because you're using an adaptive dynamics framework, whether you checked for robustness if you allow for, let's say, large mutational steps, or if you introduce just all-out effectors, which would not occur in the case of the adaptive dynamics framework, whether you could still sustain cooperation under this synergistic framework.
What we did, and as far as I remember, you can, right? If you have sufficient cooperative investment, then it's better to invest. What you get back is actually higher than what you get if you invest.
Oh, so then you basically resolve the social dilemma through the synergistic effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm not so sure about it is always the case, or if it only happened for some cases. We have to look it up, but at least for some of these functions it's good enough to install.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, and also thank you, Åke, again.